Acts chapter 18, if you got your Bibles. Acts 18. Brian Adams told us in his song that the summer of '69 changed everything forever, and I think history bears that out. You can make a pretty good case that the world did change forever in 1969. I wasn't here then. I was 16 years away, but I've read about it a lot. I really enjoy that time of American history. It was a summer of love. It was Woodstock. It's about the time when the first baby boomers, if my math is right, are coming to age. And it's the time when in the American West, we kind of moved or started to move from what sociologists would call a mass society to a secular society. And what I mean by that is that's the time, you can almost pinpoint it, where people started to do whatever they wanted to do. Up until that point, it seemed that people operated more in line with what the group of people was doing. And so a lot of people went to church because a lot of people they knew went to church, and they were involved in different things, PTA and all kinds of stuff, because the people they knew were involved in those things. And about that time, people started to say, I don't really care what everybody else is doing. I think I just want to do what I want to do. And so we moved from a mass society to what's called today the age of authenticity, where essentially the mindset is I can do whatever I want to do. It doesn't matter what other people think about it. Nobody's going to tell me that I can't do it. All things are okay for me. Nothing is out of bounds. I can do anything, and nobody's going to tell me any different. You've probably heard that mindset. It's pretty common in our world today. Everything's okay, and maybe that's how you feel about things in our world today. We know that mindset. It's very common in our world today. It may be that mindset of I can do whatever I want, nobody's going to tell me any different, it may be that's the most common mindset that we hear in our little corner of the world today. It's a mindset that prioritizes my rights, and really specifically my right to do whatever in the world I want to do. All things are lawful, everything's okay. That's what we say anyway. And we're not the first to say it. In fact, it's a relatively new development, that mindset is in our world, in our Western world today. But it goes back thousands and thousands of years to the city that we read about in Acts chapter 18. When you sail into the ports of Corinth in Greece, maybe in the spring of AD 50, you arrive at a place in which you can do literally just about anything in the world that you want to do. Everything's okay. Not much is against the rules. Nobody really even knows, like if we decided to have a set of rules in Corinth in AD 50, nobody would really even agree on who would make the rules if we ever decided that rules were okay. Everything's okay, all things are lawful, nobody's going to tell me any different, and they like it that way. It's kind of what their city is built on. Let me tell you, just for like 2 minutes, here's what's happening in Corinth about 2,000 years ago. The city sits on a little narrow strip of land. It's just 6 miles from one major sea to another major sea. Well, that 6 miles would take you a couple of hundred sea miles if you had to sail around to get to the other side. And so they decided in Corinth, we could enlist the work of slaves, and we could put these ships on a set of rollers and pull those things across the 6 miles while the sailors enjoy their time in town. The slaves will pull the boat across, and we're saving hundreds of dangerous miles at sea. We're saving a lot of time, and we are saving a lot of money. And so the sailors would embark in Corinth, or they'd get off their boat, and they would spend a few days there while their boat was transported. Corinth was a place of doing whatever you wanted to do. It was a place of tourism. It was a place of business. It was a place of manufacturing. Every 2 years, they had kind of a mini Olympics called the Isthmian Games, which brought even more tourism and business opportunities into the land. And so for a year, they're preparing for those games. For about 6 months after the games, they're tearing everything down. Then they get a 6-month break before they build everything back again. And so Corinth is this place where people are always coming in and out, always bringing new ideas, new thoughts, and new ways of doing things. People from all over the known world show up in Corinth. It's a city of about 50,000 residents, very metropolis kind of place, multicultural, multi-ethnic. Some are wealthy. About 5% have some degree of wealth in Corinth. 95% are relatively poor. There are a small handful of folks in Corinth who have a lot of power, but the vast majority of people are very weak. But they all seek the Corinthian dream. Man, they are all trying to find a leg up, trying to find their way in the world. They see this as a place of opportunity. I'm in this place in Corinth where I can do whatever I want. There are no rules. Nobody's going to tell me no. I can do anything however I want to do it. That's the mindset of the people who live in Corinth. There's a lot of money to be made. There are important positions for people to seek. There are tons of people to win to your side. And in Corinth, you do whatever it takes to get that done, and it's all okay. There are no rules in Corinth. Not really any rules, anyway. And so the city itself becomes a very competitive place. It's a place that's full of self-sufficient people. It's a place that's full of selfish people who are doing anything to feed their ambition to succeed. It's shaped by consumerism. And so when you think about what Corinth is like, this is for a list of four kind of mindsets that they have. It's freedom, it's competition, it's success by any means, and it's a lot of self-promotion. Does that sound familiar? Does that kind of culture kind of ring a bell for you? Does it maybe hit a little bit too close to home for you? Man, they're seeking freedom and their rights at all costs. They're seeking a leg up. They're very ambitious. It's a win at all costs kind of mindset, and it doesn't matter who I got to step on to get there. Very competitive. Man, you can do whatever in the world you want to do. Does that sound like a very familiar culture to you? Well, interestingly enough, and then inside that culture, everybody's religious. When you arrive in Corinth, there's like a church on every corner. Not a Christian church, but a religious group of people who've assembled around some god or some goddess. Everybody's religious. Everybody worships something. Corinth is home to 4 major shrines. Let me tell you about them real quick. There's a shrine of Hermes, where worshipers would go if they wanted success with their flocks or their herds or their agriculture, business successes, things like that. There's the shrine of Hercules, where if you needed some kind of strength or power or a leg up, you would go there, maybe to give thanks for your successes at the shrine of Hercules. There's a shrine of Athena, and that's where you would go if you were seeking wisdom or if you were going to war soon and you wanted good results in your warfare. You'd go to Athena's shrine. Sailors who show up into town so their boat can be hauled across the 6 miles would likely go to Poseidon's shrine first, where they would give thanks for their safe travels in the hospitality they've had on the seas. In addition to the 4 shrines in Corinth, there are 2 major temples. One's medical, one is kind of the opposite. There's the temple of Asclepius, where you would go if you were seeking treatment or health or healing or rejuvenation. If you had received some kind of healing and were just feeling good, when you were feeling bad, you could go and make an offering there. And by far, the most famous and the most visited temple, religious site in Corinth is the temple of Aphrodite. She's the goddess of love and fertility and of sex. And at that temple, there are 1,000 women who sell nothing but themselves. Convenient that kind of temple is in a place where men have been out to sea for months on end, and they come home for a few days while their boat's being transported and spend a few days in Corinth. Everybody's religious. Everybody worships something or somebody. Everybody's got their god or their goddess. There are no atheists in Corinth. Everybody is seeking something or giving thanks for what they have, whether it is success or power or strength or wisdom or war, fighting or travels, vacations or health or healing, of feeling younger and being rejuvenated, or love and sex. Everybody is seeking something or thankful for something in that Corinthian culture. Does that sound familiar? When you think about that list of ideals, sound familiar? Sound like what a lot of people, not just in Corinth 2,000 years ago, were seeking, but does it sound a little bit like what we're seeking in our world today? It sounds pretty familiar to me. It seems like things haven't changed a whole lot over the last couple thousand years. Well, if you're in Acts chapter 18, we're in AD 50, about 15 years or so after the death and burial and resurrection of Jesus and the institution of the church in Acts chapter 2. Well, about 15 years have passed, and the church is growing, and the gospel is spreading, and people are becoming Christians, and churches are being planted. out all over the place. They've had meetings because the church has been so successful and people are coming in droves to give their life to Christ, and they're just not sure. The leaders aren't sure if we really want those people around here. Well, a lot of those people lived in Corinth. So, in AD 50, in Acts chapter 18, Paul arrives from Athens, sleepy college town to the north, down to Corinth, which is anything but a sleepy little town. As is his custom, Paul is going to, in those first 4 verses or so, he's going to show up at the synagogue in verse 4 every Sabbath day. He's going to show up at the synagogue, and he is going to reason and talk and teach the Jews that show up at that synagogue every Saturday. And what he's going to do with those folks is use their scriptures, the Old Testament as we know it, and he's going to use their scriptures to show them that Jesus is the fulfillment of God's promises, that Jesus is the fulfillment of the prayers that these folks have been making over and over and over again. Something interesting about the synagogue is that it's probably the one place in town where people go to worship one God. Everybody else in Corinth, the vast majority of people who live in Corinth, they worship all kinds of things. Everybody else in Corinth is going to this God for this and that goddess for that, and who knows where to receive everything that they want in life. But the synagogue is the place where they worship one God. Synagogue is the place where they are committed to serving that one God by listening to the rules in the book that one God has left them. That's what they're doing down at the synagogue. And everybody in Corinth thinks that's strange, to rely on one God, who you're not really sure he's going to come through or not, and listen to the teachings of his book to set the course for your life. But nevertheless, the synagogue is there. They're hoping for God to send one to liberate their world from sin, their lives from sin. And my goodness, you'd be hard-pressed to find a city that needs more cleansing than Corinth. Sin is everywhere, rampant in nearly every aspect of their culture. That sound familiar? I think that it should. Because we are basically living in a modern-day Corinth. The ethos is the same. The culture is very similar. The desires, the longings of the heart haven't changed a whole lot. We're still seeking a lot of the same things, just in different ways. We don't give them fancy names like Hermes or Hercules or Aphrodite, but we're seeking the same values that those folks sought when they went to those temples to worship and to serve those gods. Well, if you pick up in Acts 18, verse 5, things are going pretty well. Silas and Timothy arrive from Macedonia into Corinth, and Paul is occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that the Christ was Jesus. And when they opposed and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I'm innocent. So from now on, I will go to the Gentiles." And he left there, and he went to the house of a man named Titus Justus, a worshiper of God. His house was next door to the synagogue. And Crispus, pretty important guy, ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord together with his entire household. And many of the Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. And the Lord said to Paul one night in a vision, "Do not be afraid, but go on speaking and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you. I have many in this city," he says, "who are my people." And so Paul stayed 1 year and 6 months teaching the word of God among them. So what's happening in Acts chapter 18 is Paul has showed up in this place where they are worshiping all kinds of things, all kinds of people, and they're seeking all kinds of desires. And he showed up at this place in the synagogue where they're serving the one God, and he uses their book, the Torah, to teach them that Jesus is the one that they're actually looking for. Well, Paul's endeavors become pretty successful, so much so that the Jews get really upset with him, and long story short, they throw him out of the synagogue. That's okay. It's not the first time, won't be the last time that Paul's been thrown out of some place. It's pretty common in his life, and it's actually good, because there are plenty of other people in Corinth who need Jesus. There are plenty of other people in town who need Jesus. And again, doesn't that sound familiar? This is not just a story that happens in ancient Corinth 2,000 years ago. This is a story that really applies to us in our world today. So what you have in Corinth, in this city of freedom and competition and success by any means, you got this place of of self-satisfaction. Whenever things go well, it's a place of self-promotion. And Paul shows up and he begins preaching this gospel that confronts it on every area. Whether he's in the synagogue, he's thrown out of it, or in the marketplace, or down by the fountains in the city, when travelers or tourists come into his shop to buy some tents, Paul talks about the gospel. Now, it'd be real easy for me to leave it there and say, so here's the takeaway. Wherever you go in life, go preach the gospel. Whatever you do in life, go preach the gospel. With your words or with your life, go preach the gospel. But it's not that easy. Paul doesn't just preach a general gospel. Instead, he takes the good news and he preaches a completely countercultural gospel in Corinth. He confronts the very thoughts and the values and the dreams of the people in that Corinthian culture. And if you're paying attention, our society is not that much different. And so what Paul does when he confronts them is he confronts us. When he challenges their thoughts, he challenges my thoughts. When he challenges their goals and their dreams and their aspirations, he challenges me. When he talks to them about how they live their lives and how they go through their lives and how they treat other people and what's most important to them, he's talking to us about how we go through our lives and how we live our lives and how we treat other people in our lives. For instance, just a couple of examples here. The Corinthians loved to talk about themselves, their accomplishments, and all the good that they had done. Man, if they'd have had social media in those days, who knows what the timeline would have looked like. But Paul shows up, and it's totally different than anything they've ever known. He shows up as a servant, and he humbly gives up the rights that the Corinthians loved for the sake of the gospel. In fact, Paul's very approach to life contradicted the expected values in the city of Corinth, where climbing the ladder is the most common occupation. Paul says, I'm not about that. I came to you, he says in 1 Corinthians 2, not with excellencies of words or great speeches or anything like that, but just to talk about Christ crucified. The Corinthians were constantly competing, constantly at odds with one another, trying to outdo one another, trying to get a leg up on one another. And Paul comes with this message. And in 1 Corinthians 1:10, he says, look, I don't want you to be at odds with one another. I want you to be all of the same mind, of the same thought, that there be no divisions among you. And he says, I've heard about y'all, that some of y'all are following one guy and some are following another guy, and everybody's at odds with one another, and you're competing with one another to see who has the biggest following. And Paul said, I just don't want you to do that. We're all on the same team, he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. I plant and Apollos waters, and it's God who gives the increase. And so stop constantly competing with one another in your culture. It's not just a generalized gospel of Jesus came and lived and died and will come again. It's the gospel impacts everything about every day of your life in Corinth. And we're not that much different. The Corinthians were a very proud people, proud to tell you about their accomplishments, proud of what they had done, proud of who they were. And in response, Paul says, if you look around in the church, there are not many wise, there are not many noble, not many of high stature. Paul says, we came in weakness, and the weak have come to Christ. Paul says, we didn't come to boast in ourselves, but we only boast in the cross. That's his mindset. When he writes them a letter, 1 Corinthians chapter 13 is a whole chapter committed to the idea of love. And everything in that chapter flies against the values of the Corinthian culture. It resonates with the features that were absent and that should have been there in Corinth. He talks about how love looks for the good in others. And the people in Corinth had no thought of that. They wanted to look for the good in themselves and be better than everybody else. Love is patient and love is kind. The Corinthians had no concept of that. And so Paul writes them a whole letter with a whole chapter. It's a completely countercultural call. It calls them out of the way they were living, out of the lives they were used to living, and into something way better in following Jesus. And so, here's the mindset. Here's what's happening in Acts chapter 18. Paul has showed up into this place where they value a lot of the things that we value in our world. He showed up in this place where they're trying to get ahead, and they're working hard, and they're trying to be better than the next guy. That's what the mindset is. And he's come to this place where they worship all kinds of gods and goddesses, and we don't do that anymore, but we worship the same things. And they're seeking the wealth, and they're seeking the prosperity and the security and the war, and they're seeking the love and the sex and the acceptance, and they're seeking popularity and prestige all over the place. And Paul shows up and says, what we need to do is be free from all of that, to come out of that kind of life and to live a life that models Jesus. And if you're thinking about it from a purely secular standpoint, I understand why people would say that'll never work. That's not going to work in our world today. You can't just go out there and talk to people about Jesus. You can't just go out there and present the gospel in a way that conflicts with the way the culture runs. You can't just go out there and talk about Bible and tell people that the way the world operates is just not right. Can't do that. It'll never work. That's what they thought. It'd be easy for the Corinthians to step back and say, you know what? They already got their gods. They're already worshiping something. Everybody's religious. There are no atheists in Corinth. Remember, nobody's an atheist at this point. Everybody is seeking something or giving thanks to their gods for what they've got, whether it's business success or wealth or money or power or strength or war or vacations or love or sex or rejuvenation or healing. They're all seeking something. They ain't got no room for Jesus. It'd be easy for them to say that. And our world is seeking the same things. So it's easy for us in a church on a Sunday morning to look at our world and think that with so many things people are seeking, we don't call them gods anymore. But it's easy for us to think that people are seeking so much and their lives are so full, their busy schedules, their plates are so full that they just don't have any room for Jesus. So spreading the gospel is not going to work anymore. And the church is doomed to die. Look around. I mean, the statistics don't lie, right? Churches are declining everywhere. Churches are shutting their door all over the place. It ain't going to work anymore. That's what we think because people are just so full of everything else. Well, if I'm honest with you, let's just be real. That's a cop-out. We're better than that. The gospel is more important than that. Jesus is more important than that. And Paul knew nothing else but people in every city that he visited in the empire, especially Corinth. Paul knew nothing else than people worshiping all kinds of gods. And so in my mind, Paul would laugh at our objections if we sit back in a room somewhere and say, there's no way people are not just receptive to the gospel anymore. Don't want to be Christians anymore. Paul would laugh at us. He dealt with that at every stop along the way. He knew that what the city needed was the church. Paul knew that what the city needed was Jesus, and I wonder if we just hadn't figured that out yet. We got this defeatist mindset sometimes that says churches are declining and people don't want to be Christians anymore, and woe is us, Christians in the minority, getting worse and worse every day. I wonder if we just need to figure out what Paul figured out. That what the world needs is a church. Not a church that operates unlike Jesus, but a church that looks like Jesus. That's what the world needs. And so what started out in Corinth in AD 50 as a group of about 50 people, that's about all they could hold in their houses. A group of about 50 people in Paul's time in the city of Corinth of 50,000 people is a church that we still read about today. Read about it in Acts 18. A couple of letters bear their name in your New Testament, 1st and 2nd Corinthians. 2,000 years later, that little group of people in a city that worshiped all kinds of other gods and goddesses and all kinds of other things, that little group of people made a lasting impact on the face of the planet. You think it can't happen again? The community of Jesus followers that started as a really small, tiny minority in the Roman Empire became a world-changing church over the course of a few hundred years. Now, it took some time. And sometimes they needed a little bit of encouragement and a little bit of help along the way. That's why Paul wrote them letters. And maybe we need some of that refocusing help as well. That church turned the world upside down, and I believe that it can happen again unless Christians don't act like Jesus. The church doesn't look like Jesus, then it's not going to happen. If the Christians don't act like Jesus, maybe there's some things Paul needs to say to us. And so the church is planted in Corinth in about AD 50. About 4 years later, in AD 54, Paul gets some news reports from the church at Corinth that he planted, that he lived with there for a year and a half. He hears a report from Chloe's household, and the Corinthian church sends him a letter with several questions. The letter of 1 Corinthians is a response to both of those needs. It's interesting, the first 6 chapters or so are his response to Chloe's household. And in those first 6 chapters, Paul is very clear-cut. I mean, he lets them know, here's what I've heard. If this is going on, you got to stop it. Very clear-cut, very direct, and at times he's very stern with them. Not an easy read all the times. But his response to the Corinthian questions that begins in chapter 7 is a little bit different. There are kind of 2 sides to this letter. From chapter 7 onward, Paul recognizes the complexity of some very sensitive issues and sensitive areas in the church where most of the time he has something to say to people on both sides of an issue. Very interesting how he does that. He recognizes that everything's not cut and dry. And so in writing that letter, 1 Corinthians, Paul addresses certain practices and certain mindsets in the church that had become common and had become normative. And really what Paul is doing in the letter to 1 Corinthians is saying, here are the places where it seems like the culture of the town has crept into the church. And remember, their society doesn't seem like it's a whole lot different than ours, does it? And so when they let the values of their world creep into the church, they needed to refocus. And hey, who would say we're any better off in 2023? When we bring those worldly values into Christianity, maybe we need to refocus. That's what Paul calls them to. In Acts 18, when the whole thing starts, and that's what he refocuses them on in 1 Corinthians. And so we're going to study this for a little while, for a few weeks. It's a tough letter. 1 Corinthians is gritty, and it's real, and it's honest. I mean, through this letter, you're going to see Paul pour out his heart to people who are his friends, people that he converted to Christianity, people that he lived with for a year and a half, people that he discipled, and people who have gone totally off the rails, like nothing we've seen in our congregations for a long time. They had real issues. And so this is gritty and real and honest. And Paul's calling them to refocus and get back to Christianity, true, real Christianity, so they can be a healthy, functional, Christ-centered church again. And so it's gritty, real, and honest. But it's also very contemporary. It's a letter that touches on many of the values in our world today. And you'll see this as we go through this. Self-image and identity. He's going to touch on pride and security and insecurity. He's going to talk about sex and marriage and singleness in his letter. He's going to talk about leadership, and he's going to talk about the church, and he's going to talk about what happens whenever you come together as a church. He's going to talk about gender identities. It's very contemporary for our world today. Sound familiar? It's a letter for people who tend to participate in Christianity as one segment of their lives. And it's so that we can realize maybe that following Jesus must, it's a necessity, that following Jesus will bring us into conflict with some of the values in our culture. It did with them. And if our society's not a whole lot different, then it must challenge some of the worldviews present in our world today. They had their religions. They had their secular values. They had their emperor worship in Rome, Roman Empire in Corinth. And today, we have our religions. We've got our secular values. Some of us have our emperor worship today in 21st century America. And Paul will tell them that you can't live with one foot in the church and the other foot firmly planted in the values of your world. The Corinthians were a church that wanted a little bit of Jesus and a little bit of a whole lot of other things that run directly against him. A little bit of Jesus and a whole lot of other things that don't resemble Jesus at all. And so this sermon And this letter, it's a reminder that just like those people 2,000 years ago needed Jesus, we do too. It's a reminder that no matter how bad the problems are in our church, in our lives, in our world, there is good news in Jesus. It's a reminder that just because we're Christians doesn't mean that we still don't need Jesus. And that once we decide to follow Jesus, it means that we may need to leave some of those other things behind. Can't. Christianity's not a religion that you can have one foot in and the other foot planted somewhere else. It calls us to make changes. It calls us to make decisions. And it may very well call us to completely overhaul our lives. And I think that's what Jesus meant when he said, if anybody wants to follow me, let him deny himself, take up his cross. Paul would add, put off some of those old secular worldly values, put on the new, so that we can follow Jesus. Might be that today is the day that you need to do that. Paul started in Corinth with a very small number, but it grew. And it's not uncommon in Christianity for very small beginnings to grow into something great and world-changing. Maybe your journey starts today. If you're here today and not yet a Christian, not yet following Jesus, we always want to make an opportunity for you to decide to do that. We have an invitation song just for that. And so maybe today is the day that you're ready to be baptized into Christ. You have faith in him, but you're ready to turn away from one foot in and one foot in something else. And you're ready to commit fully to denying yourself, taking up your cross daily and following Jesus. And so maybe baptism is your next step, where you are united with Christ in baptism into his death. And you rise up out of the water, sins washed away, forgiven, ready to live this new kind of life that Paul is going to call us back to in 1 Corinthians. So maybe that's your need today. Have your sins washed away, fresh start, new beginnings. Or maybe you're a Christian who's got a foot in the church, a foot in Christianity, want a little bit of Jesus, but you want a lot of other things. And a lot of those other things just don't resemble Jesus at all. So the message of 1 Corinthians seems to be that, yes, there is good news for bad problems. There are good news for bad times. Sometimes Christians need to come back to Jesus too. And so whatever your need might be this morning to become a Christian, to come back to Jesus, we want to make sure that you have an opportunity to do just that all together.